Welcome all. This is a module called Ecosystems and Biogeochemistry within the Fundamentals of Ecology series. I am Shumanto Bagchi and I work at the Center for Ecological Sciences at IISc Bangalore. So this is a two-part series. This is part 1. Let me just quickly go over the goals and outlines of this module. There are 2 lectures or 2 videos on this, and because ecosystems and biogeochemistry are interrelated topics, these 2 lectures will contain overlapping in pieces of information. For example, there will be some parts about ecosystems in part 1 as well as biogeochemistry, and again in part 2 we will cover a little bit of ecosystems and biogeochemistry. It's not as if there's one lecture on ecosystems and everything about biogeochemistry is in part 2. These 2 things will merge together. So we'll go over some definitions and some concepts. Broadly, we will talk about life on Earth and how it relates to the chemistry of the planet, and we will also think about some applications of these concepts relating to ecosystem science and biogeochemical cycles. And then there will be opportunities for you to go and do some independent reading about the material that will be covered. So broadly, ecosystem science or ecosystem ecology is considered to be the study of interactions between organisms and their environment as an integrated system. The emphasis here is on the word integrated, and the context for this integration is the Earth system. So it's the ecology of the whole planet and all the parts that work together to make the Earth a very unique place in the universe for us. Now here's a picture on the right. It's famously called the pale blue dot. It was taken on 14th February 1990 by the astronauts on the Voyager spacecraft, and as the Earth was coming out of the shadow, it was hit by it went past a beam of sunlight, and it's called a pale blue dot because it's really pale and it's really small. So some of you may not be able to see it, but here's Earth when the astronauts were looking at it from the Voyager spacecraft. I'll just zoom in a little bit, and this is it. This is the Earth. This is where we live. Everybody you know, everybody you have heard about, everything that you've seen, it's all here. It's very small compared to the rest of the universe, and indeed even the solar system. So this Earth system provides us with the template within which to understand how ecosystems work and how biogeochemical cycles operate. So these are mostly related to the cycling of materials and the flow of energy from one compartment to the other, and the processes that happen at the cellular scale, which is single-celled organisms or even a single cell inside a multicellular organism. These processes can be aggregated together all the way to the planetary scale. So the ecosystems and biogeochemistry, they span a very large, they span across many different scales in which they operate. So here's another picture of the Earth. It's called the blue marble. It was taken by the astronauts of the Apollo 17 spacecraft on December 7, 1972, and it's a very good representation of what we mean by the Earth system. So in the bottom you can sort of see that there's airflow happening and there are clouds in the sky. There's ocean currents as well. Here you see Antarctica, which is a continent that's completely frozen. You can probably see that the equatorial parts of Africa are quite green. Then the deserts of the Sahara and Arabia are quite barren, and there's circulation happening, air is flowing, oceans are creating waves and currents. So this is the integrated Earth system. Ecosystems and biogeochemistry operates at the planetary scale. Now, what we are interested today is to study the properties of life as it relates to the land and water, as it relates to the air, and then the connections between these 3, which allows us to call it bio, geo, and chemistry. So bio is the properties of the living organisms, geology is the template provided by the planet, and chemistry is the reactions that happen to make everybody who they are. So now, one interesting property of life is that it is chemistry of the light elements of the periodic table. So we know that the periodic table is quite large and there are a number of elements, but do not be surprised if you realize that living organisms and all living matter consists of very few elements out of this vast collection available in the periodic table, and these are the light elements. So here I have used the symbols for the different members of the solar system. So here's the sun, and we know that most of the mass of the solar system is inside the sun, and then as we go away from it we see the different planets, so Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn and so on. One thing that we will notice is further away from the sun you have these gas planets. These are giants much larger than the Earth, but they are almost entirely made up of gases. But closer to the sun there are smaller planets which have, these are called the rocky planets, and they are made up of both minerals which are in the rocks as well as gases which form a layer surrounding these rocks which we are familiar with as our atmosphere. Now this is something you would expect if you are in the solar system where there is a massive object in the center and things are spinning around it, and just like in a centrifuge the lighter elements are away from the center and the denser elements are closer to the center. So we are on a planet which is quite dense. It contains the heavy elements as the minerals and the lighter elements as the gases. If we just look inside the Earth, we will also see more or less the same thing, that the core of the Earth contains the heavier elements and the crust contains the lighter elements, and the lightest elements are the gases which form a thin layer of atmosphere on the outside. Now what exactly is the chemistry associated with these light elements? So we can think of the chemistry of the light elements as some building blocks which we can call monomers. For example, there are units of life such as carbon dioxide, nitrogen and water which is available on the surface, and what life or life forms have been doing for the past 4 billion years is to perform elaborate chemical reactions which convert these building blocks into polymers. So the main polymers that you are probably already familiar with are nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, proteins, lipids, cellulose, chitin and so on. And then these polymers are again converted back into these building blocks by other organisms. So this is a cycle which goes back and forth and round and round. So everything that we know about carbon fixation or nitrogen fixation is the conversion of these building blocks into more complex molecules, and then their breakdown through anabolic and catabolic reactions. So we can call them carbon fixation, we can understand them as nitrogen fixation. The organisms which do the carbon fixation are the producers. The energy that they trap is then passed on to animals who are the consumers, and when these plants and animals die, the decomposers get to work and release all these building blocks again into the atmosphere. So when this happens, we call those connections as food webs, and energy flows from the lower trophic levels in a food web to the upper trophic levels. So the two main reactions that are happening here is the photosynthetic reactions which build things, and respiration which oxidizes the products of photosynthesis and releases the carbon dioxide and the building blocks. When seen together, they constitute what we can call as the nutrient cycles. So now let's look at where life is distributed on Earth. Now, one thing that should immediately come to notice is that the conditions on Earth are not uniform. Things are not spread evenly across this round planet. So the most important differences which are very evident to us is the differences in temperature and precipitation. Temperature and precipitation are uneven, they are not uniform across the world. So now this helps us connect to ecosystems because it generates the concept of biome. It connects very easily with the concept of biome. Biomes are broad categories which contain similar types of ecosystems. So now a lot of this has to do with the Earth's tilted axis. So it's not, I mean, unlike this picture, when the Earth's revolving around the sun, it's actually revolving on a tilted axis. So let's see why this tilt is important and what does this tilt do. So let me draw the Earth here, and let's see, this is the tilted axis. It's tilted currently at 23.5 degrees. This is the equator, and if I go 23.5 degrees this way, I can draw another line on the northern hemisphere, which is the Tropic of Cancer, and a similar line here, which is called the Tropic of Capricorn. Now we have the sun on somewhere here, which is releasing radiation towards us. We are at the surface of the Earth, and this incoming radiation is coming towards us. Now, one thing that we should realize is that because of the tilt, the amount of radiation received per unit area is higher near the equator, and as we go further away from the equator, the flux or the density per unit area of light energy received by us begins to decline. In fact, at the poles, if you are in the summer at the North Pole, you will barely see the sun come up beyond the horizon. It will just do a circle very close to the horizon, and it will never reach you, and you won't be able to see the sun directly above your head. But if you are near the equator, many days of the year, if you look up, you will see the sun directly overhead. And the conditions flip between the northern and the southern hemisphere. So a person who's in the winter in the southern hemisphere near the South Pole will similarly not see the sun come up at all. It will just skirt around very close to the horizon, and it will be very long nights. So now what does the solar energy do? What does the solar energy do when it passes through the atmosphere and reaches the surface of the planet? Well, our atmosphere is very transparent to incoming solar radiation, but then this radiation gets absorbed and is re-radiated by the Earth as longer wavelengths of light. Now our atmosphere is very opaque to the Earth's radiation, so it heats up the gases which are part of this atmosphere. So when Earth radiates its heat towards the outside, it heats up these gases, and what do you think will happen when a parcel of gas becomes hot? You would expect this parcel of gas to rise, it will go upwards. So we have incoming radiation near the equator where maximum amount of heating is taking place, and the gases are rising, they are going away from you. So you are standing here, and this hot pocket of air is traveling upwards. Now hot air can contain a lot of moisture, it can carry a lot of moisture with it. So this hot pocket of air is absorbing water vapor as it is rising. Now because this is a closed system, you can't have a vacuum left behind near the surface, so air from the surrounding areas come and fill up the space that was formerly occupied by this hot pocket of air. Now if you are rising through the atmosphere, you will also cool down. So as this hot pocket of air rises, it begins to cool down and it expands. Now cool air is familiar to us because we know that hill stations are cooler than the plains, and then many of us have probably gone for vacations and holidays there. So this is the same principle. This is called adiabatic cooling, and as this pocket of air cools down, it also retains less and less moisture. Hot air brought up a lot of moisture, cool air cannot hold on to it, so it drops it back towards the surface. So this falls back to Earth as a lot of rain. So we get a lot of rain near the equator. Now this air eventually, because of the Earth's Coriolis effect, spins northwards in the northern hemisphere, and it spins this way in the southern hemisphere. Now it has become cold, it's reached a certain height in the atmosphere, it begins to fall back down, because you cannot leave a vacuum and just not have anything occupy that empty space. So now this air is re-entering and it's getting closer to the surface. And you may be familiar with this already, that when a spaceship re-enters the Earth's orbit or re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, it begins to get hot, and there is a lot of engineering that goes into protecting these rockets which are re-entering. So this pocket of air which is coming back towards the ground also begins to heat up. It used to be hot when it was here, then it became cool, it lost all the moisture, and then it's coming back towards the surface and is heating up again. So now the areas which are just north of the tropics, this band in the north and this band in the south, they have a supply of very dry and hot air coming towards them. So these places generally support deserts. So if you look at a map of the world, the Sahara, Arabia, the North American desert, and once again in the Atacama in South America, most of Australia, they're all located around this 30 degrees north and south latitudes. These are where the deserts are located. This middle band here, where there is a lot of rain, you get tropical rainforest. Okay, and then there are smaller cycles which operate beyond this major loop of air which is going up and down. The main one is called the Hadley cell, and there are smaller ones which go after the Hadley cells as well. And there is a band here and a band there, beyond which it's too cold to support large forms of life. So you get the tundra vegetation beyond a certain point and the taiga vegetation below a certain point. So this tilt of the earth causes air circulation patterns which, coupled with the Coriolis effect, give rise to combinations of dry or warm, dry and warm, cool and wet climatic zones, and these are occupied predictably by different types of vegetation and life forms that we call biomes. Here's a diagram of the main biomes. They're arranged on an axis of temperature on the x-axis and precipitation on the y-axis. So this part of the graph contains areas that are fairly warm but do not receive a lot of rainfall. So these are the deserts. This part of the graph contains areas which are warm but receive a lot of rainfall. So here you see the tropical rainforest. These areas are very cold as well as dry, so this is the tundra. And the intermediate spaces are filled up with different types of vegetation, different types of biome. So there are temperate ecosystems which constitute the temperate rainforest biome, the tropical savannas which are here, and so on. So the tilt of the earth gives us predictable patterns which are evident in the form of deserts, which can be both hot and cold. Hot deserts are the typical deserts, and cold deserts are the ones which are at high elevations. Then we see rainforests in certain zones of this graph made up of precipitation and temperature. Cold places where it's possible for trees to grow, you get the taiga. Where trees cannot grow, you get the tundra. The other thing that the tilt of the earth does, it creates seasonality. So the further away you are from the equator, the more seasonal your environment becomes. The different months of the year are very different from each other. But if you are closer to the equator, the sun is almost always shining directly overhead, and there's very little seasonality. January through December, every day or every month of the year is more or less similar to the previous one. Okay, the other aspect of ecosystems and biogeochemical cycles is that material is constantly recycled. The earth is practically a closed system, so very little matter leaves the earth and very little matter enters the earth from the outside. In the history of the earth, back in the the past it was more open, but today for the past several billion years it's been more or less closed. So now the amount of material that is taken from the air by plants, which is carbon dioxide, and converted into biomass, is called gross primary production. Now plants use some of the material to sustain themselves, and what is left behind as plant biomass is called net primary production. In many ecosystems, this net primary production can be handed over to consumers. These consumers take the plant material and use the energy in it to build their own body mass as well as support their metabolism. So those consumers are the secondary producers, such as the herbivores. Now you can have predators or carnivores which can consume these herbivores. So you have primary, secondary and tertiary production. Sometimes you can have longer food chains in places such as the ocean. So herbivory predators, they consume the plants and make a dent in how much biomass remains as plant matter versus how much is passed on into other forms. What is left over, especially in an annual seasonal cycle, is often burnt by fire. So a large amount of material is recycled back into the atmosphere as fire, and some amount of material is recycled back into the atmosphere when plants do their respiration, when animals do their respiration. So they take the carbon atom which was originally in the air, it went into the plants, went into the animals, and then came back into the air through respiration. And when what is left over by fire decomposes, and here's a group of microbes, usually in the soil, which act on the leftover matter and then they break them down. They conduct their respiration and release the building blocks back into the air. So everything starts as material that is available in the atmosphere and then passes through different organisms and eventually finds its way back into the atmosphere. So we are temporary vessels made up of molecules and atoms that came from the atmosphere, and we again go back to the atmosphere. So two important aspects of this cycle is the cycle concerning carbon and the one concerning nitrogen. Now suppose an atom is taken from the air and converted into biomass by plants that become trees. These are trees, they are very large in size, they are growing near the equator or maybe in the temperate belt. Now one important thing about trees and forests is that they are made up of wood, their structure is such, they are made up of molecules that are very large polymers, and these properties make trees very difficult to eat for animals. Although there are a lot of animals in the forest, the material that the trees are made up of is not very digestible. So a lot of the consumers and the predators in forests are small organisms such as caterpillars and insects, and the predators are also predators of caterpillars and insects such as spiders. A large fraction of the material and energy which passes through from the trees to other trophic levels constitutes of small animals, small organisms such as insects. What is left over can of course catch fire, and there's a lot of forest fire that happens which converts trees back into gases. So one thing to note about trees and forest ecosystems is that the producers are very large, the consumers are quite small compared to the producers. And what's left over decomposes. So fungi and bacteria, they recycle all this material. When this dead log completely decomposes, it goes back as air molecules into the atmosphere. Now let's look at another type of plants, another type of ecosystem. Instead of trees, now we look at grasses, and two grassy ecosystems that are very common are the savannas and the grasslands. Grasslands are ecosystems which rarely have any trees, they are almost entirely made up of grasses. Savannas have a scattering of trees, so they don't have a continuous layer of tree cover, but they have a few scattered trees. And now if you are a plant that is growing in these grasslands or savannas, you are not very similar, you are very dissimilar to the trees in the forests. One big property that you are different in is that animals can eat you. You can be very easily consumed and digested, so you are much more palatable than trees. So therefore, if you look at pictures of the savanna, for example, this one is from the African savanna, they are full of animals that can eat and digest grass. So here the consumers are fairly large in body size. They are in fact much larger than the plants they are eating, unlike the forest where the insects were much smaller than the trees and the leaves they were eating. And the predators are also very different. Here you have lions and wolves and whatnot. And what's left over in the annual cycle can also burn, so you can have fire in grassland and savannas as well. This also returns material from biomass into the atmosphere. Now let's take a look at non-terrestrial ecosystems. Let's look at what happens in aquatic bodies, so ponds and lakes and oceans. Now ponds and lakes have organisms that face a difficulty in trapping CO2. CO2 in the water versus CO2 in the air are available in different amounts. So we know that there is about 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air around us, and this can be relatively easily incorporated into plant biomass through photosynthetic reactions. But a much smaller amount is available in dissolved state in the water. So it's much more difficult for plants to absorb CO2 and run the reactions for photosynthesis and their physiological metabolism. So one way to increase the probability of finding a CO2 molecule when it is rare is to increase your surface area and reduce your volume. So unlike trees in the forest that are very large, the producers in the water tend to be very small. So if you are a small single-celled organism such as photosynthetic bacteria, you have a relatively large surface area and a small volume. So most of the primary producers in the water are algae and bacteria and cyanobacteria that are often microscopic. And in contrast, the food chain contains animals that are much larger. So you have small fish, big fish that all depend on the algae. So aquatic ecosystems look like inverted versions of terrestrial ecosystems. Here the plants are very small and the animals are relatively large. The standing biomass of the producers is small, the standing biomass of the consumers is high. So in any standard textbook, you'll find more discussion on food pyramids in terrestrial settings and how it gets inverted in aquatic settings. Okay, so we've more or less reached the end of part 1. So let's do a quick recap. We tried to understand ecosystems and how they relate to the concept of biomes, and their properties are integrated within what we call the planet or the Earth system. Two main factors that define and differentiate ecosystems and biomes from one another are temperature and precipitation. More specifically, the uneven distribution of temperature and precipitation across the world, and a lot of that unevenness arises from the Earth's tilted axis. Now life consists of light elements. The heavier atoms in the periodic table generally are not associated with living forms. Only a handful of elements, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and occasionally a few metals. That's it. Life consists of chemical reactions involving the lighter elements, and these lighter elements circulate between air and water, air and land, and then back. Chemical reactions involving life, either at the cellular level or aggregated across the planetary level, essentially are conversions of air molecules into living beings and then decomposition back into air. This is the cycle where building blocks or monomers are converted to polymers and things are constantly recycled over and over again. So plants are the ones who get this started. They convert carbon dioxide into glucose and then on to several other things. Plants can be eaten by herbivores. Herbivores can use the energy that they obtain from plants to build their own body mass and support their metabolism. Herbivores can be consumed by their predators, and any biomass that is left after these consumers have fulfilled their requirements can burn, and then if something is left after a fire passes through, all it has to decompose and go back into these monomers and become part of the atmosphere again. Now there are some differences in how these things operate in terrestrial and aquatic settings. We have one generalization that in terrestrial settings, for example in forests, primary producers tend to be very large and hold a lot of biomass. Individual animals which eat these plants often are insects and caterpillars. They tend to be very small. In grasslands, the grasses are small, and the animals and the mammals and the elephants and the rhinos and the antelope, they tend to be fairly large, and things get inverted when we look at aquatic systems. The producers tend to be single-celled organisms who don't have a large amount of standing biomass, but they cycle things at a much rapid rate. But the fishes are very large. So terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems look like opposites of each other. Okay, so this brings me to the end of part 1. Some things that you can think about between now and the second lecture is, what's the role of Earth's magnetism in creating the atmospheric conditions that we experience today, and also in paleo times, which means what was the role of Earth's magnetism in the paleo atmosphere. And also think about plate tectonics and how the continents move around the Earth's crust and how that would have affected paleobiome several million years ago. The continents today are located on the Earth, and we are very familiar with where they are because we can see them on a map or a globe, but they were not always here. They have moved around quite a bit. They have merged, they have split. So what would have been the distribution of paleobiomes relative to the positions of the paleocontinents? And then also think about how humans impact the processes that we just discussed, how humans impact the rate at which monomers are polymerized, how air molecules are converted to living organisms, and then how do humans impact how these organisms return the air molecules back to the atmosphere. All right, so this is the end of part 1. I'll see you again in the second part.